love light in your eyes. Life could not hold a fairer paradise. Give me a right to love you all the while. My world forever, the sunshine of your smile.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here today, and really thrilled to be able to talk to you about the Canadian Mrs. Watt. What you see on my title slide is a picture of Mrs. Watt. She actually signed her name Madge Robertson Watt. She dated that photograph 1918. She's in uniform because of the work that she was doing in organizing women's institutes, and as Maggie said, it was considered to be part of the war effort. And so I'm thrilled to be in one of the places where she was in the first few dozen WIs that were founded. And as Maggie said, I've just come from Wales, where last weekend they had an exhibition celebrating the very first WI that was ever founded in the UK. It was not in England, sorry to say. It was in Wales, and it was actually in North Wales in Anglesey. And the women of the WIs throughout Wales put together an exhibition depicting their history, but also depicting their skills as crafters with all kinds of needlework. And I was delighted to be among about 1,500 women who passed through that exhibit last weekend. So that was quite a thrill for me to meet so many who are actively interested in the WI and in Mrs. Watt. I'm very interested in her because I am a Canadian. I teach Canadian women's history at Laurentian University, which is in Ontario, in a city called Sudbury. I know you have a Sudbury as well. My Sudbury is 4 hours north of Toronto, just so you can place me. Some of you have approached and said, oh, I've been to Canada. Where are you from? That's where I'm from, 4 hours north of Toronto. Mrs. Watt, as it turns out, was born not very far from where I grew up. So that's part of what intrigued me about her. But my first link with Mrs. Watt was this. The WI is actually a made-in-Canada idea. Maybe you knew that it was actually imported here. Now this is an odd twist. Imported from a daughter country. Doesn't happen very often. And I was delighted to know that made-in-Canada idea made its way here, took very deep roots, and in fact thrives here to this very day. In my book, I spent more than a decade, exactly a decade and a half actually, 15 years working on this book. And you might think, wow, you're a really slow researcher. Well, I teach full-time as well, but the thing about it is that Mrs. Watt left no central collection of her papers. So I did a lot of detective work. I also did a lot of grantsmanship to try to get the money to get me from where I am over here to records here, also in Australia, across Canada a couple of times, and into the United States as well. This is the historian's challenge, trying to reconstruct women's history. Often we work with very small fragmented bits, and we put them together like a big jigsaw puzzle. So you put your puzzle skills with your detective skills, and you work it out and write the history. And that's what I've done about this very intriguing person, Mrs. Watt. So we'll begin by asking ourselves, who was this Mrs. Watt anyway? And it would be interesting if we had the time for me to stop and just ask you. Some of you have already confessed, I have no idea who she was. But some of you, I think, do have some idea of who she was. And as Maggie said, she's credited with being the founder of the WI here in the UK. Founder of the Women's Institutes in Wales and England. Founding president of the ACWW. Those initials stand for Associated Country Women of the World. Associated Country Women of the World. Think of it as the next level up. WI, those of you who are familiar with it know it's a fairly structured organization with local branches and federations at different levels. The ACWW is like the international umbrella group of many, many, many different rural women's groups, of which the Women's Institutes here in the UK are one constituent member. Mrs. Watt was the founding president of that group in 1933. And she came to the UK from Canada in 1913. So a full 2 years before she founded that first WI in Anglesey. But, ... there is a very long story behind her coming. And that's mostly what I'd like to spend my time talking to you about today, is the Canadian backstory that goes before. You know, think of it as the prequel, okay, to the WI story here. Because often Mrs. Watt is depicted as a young widow with 2 small boys. That's often how the story goes of who was this Canadian. Well, she was a widow, that's true. She wasn't really young. Although the older I get, the more I realize she wasn't that old. But she was a middle-aged woman. She was 45 years old by the time she came to the UK in 1913. The folklore around this says she was a young widow with 2 small sons. They're not small. Those are her sons. The bigger one, Robin Watt, was actually 17 years old. And his young brother was very tall for 7, but that's how old he was. 10 years between these 2 boys. So, who was this Canadian who landed here? What brought her here? And what made her tick? What's the backstory? Well, Mrs. Watt was actually Madge Robertson. And her family, the Robertsons, lived in a small town. It's still a town, not a city, technically, in Ontario called Collingwood. Now, if you have a mental map of the province of Ontario in your head, it probably has Toronto on it, I hope so. The Great Lakes, think about the Great Lakes, kind of in the middle of the country of Canada, okay? And Toronto sits on top of Lake Ontario. If you go straight up, straight north from Toronto, about an hour and a half by car, you will come to the tip of one of those lakes, Georgian Bay, off Lake Huron. That's where Collingwood is. I take the time to explain to you the geography of where Collingwood is because in the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, 1870s, 80s, 90s, Collingwood was a very strategically placed little town. It was the end of the line for the rail. And trains would come to Collingwood. It was a shipbuilding town, but it was also a port where one would load up a ship with goods traveling to the west. And goods coming from the west, grain, would be offloaded at Collingwood. It was a very important place for that reason. And it was a place with a lot of ambition for itself. A lot of boosterism went on around Collingwood, Ontario. In fact, they started to call themselves the Chicago of the North. Big aspirations. It didn't quite come to fruition, but there's nothing wrong with optimism. This is the family home where Madge Robertson grew up, and you can see that it's quite a grand home. It looks like a country home, but in fact it's not in the country. It's in the town of Collingwood, along a line of very prestigious homes. 3rd Street, even today, is a place where one drives slowly to look at the lovely historic homes that dot that neighborhood. And then the Robertsons, Madge's father was a lawyer. And as I like to say, he was a very big fish in a small pond. All right, the Robertsons were very well known. He was very prestigious for a number of reasons. He was a lawyer. He was Queen's Counsel. It's interesting to me that you say the organizational meeting of the Pershore WI might have taken place in Masonic Hall. Very interesting, because Henry Robertson, Madge's father, rose to the top of the Masonic Lodge in Canada. He was the authority. He combined his law with his lodge activities. He actually wrote a book called Masonic Jurisprudence. In other words, the rule book for how the Masonic order would operate. It was designed for the Canadian Masonic Lodge, but it was used outside of Canada as well and became a real reference point. He rose to the highest office of the Masonic order in Canada, and so he fellowshipped with and traveled around to international gatherings of the Masonic Lodge. One of the things that Madge observed as she was growing up watching her very civically minded father was the value of organizational life. And in the book, I go to some length to explain what I mean by that. Madge was very used to the idea of monthly meetings, of regalia and uniform. She was used to spaces that were devoted to these public meetings and civic enterprises. This is a picture of the Collingwood Masonic Temple, very grand, on the main street of that little town where she grew up. Her daddy built that. His law office was upstairs in that same building. And on the other side of the building from the Masonic Lodge meeting space was a meeting space devoted to the Oddfellows Lodge. He also rose to the highest office of that lodge as well. So are you getting the picture? This man is very well connected. And one of the things he taught his highly observant older daughter was that when one has networked with organizations like this, one goes places. So it is no surprise at all to me that Madge might have met and organized a WI in a Masonic lodge hall. She might have used her daddy's calling card to try to explain who she was and why that would be a suitable space in which to work. I don't have photographs of it today, but Madge's mother was not just a wallflower either. Mrs. Robertson was very, very involved in her beloved Presbyterian Church. And in the 19th century, what proper Presbyterian women did, especially those with means like Mrs. Robertson, was they got involved in organizational life. She was very involved in the Women's Missionary Society that was connected with the Presbyterian Church. This tells me that Madge was used to leaflets coming through the door or being dropped off, the newsletter of the Women's Missionary Society, of the Masonic Order. She was used to parents who were very civically engaged, and she saw that through what her parents were involved with, their world got bigger. And they had a worldview that was much larger than their little town of Collingwood. Her mother, although she was a church woman, it might be our instinct to say, well, that's pretty conservative. Never underestimate what happens when a group of women meet in a church hall, drink a little tea and eat some cake. They may very well be talking about global issues, and they were talking about international missions. And Madge became aware it's a very big world out there, and that's where she grew up. Madge didn't have any brothers. Well, in fact, the Robertson family, Mrs. Robertson gave birth 4 times. But sadly, the 2 sons did not survive past their infant days. Neither of her brothers lived to see the age of 2 years old. And the brothers were the youngest 2. So there was Madge, and there was her sister, Catherine, known as Katie. So the Robertsons had these 2 daughters. Growing up in this very nice neighborhood, they were well known about town. The other thing that Mr. Robertson was widely known for, he was a big, big booster of the local public library. The Robertson women were readers from early on. And I think Madge was her daddy's favorite daughter, you know? He seems to have poured a lot of attention into her, and not just attention, but also money. He gave Madge Robertson the opportunity that very, very few women in Canada, and fewer still in other parts of the world, had enjoyed the privilege of post-secondary education. So Madge Robertson went off to university at the University of Toronto. She could simply hop on the train in Collingwood and travel by rail to Toronto and attend the provincial university. The University of Toronto only began to admit women as students in 1884. And Madge was a co-ed at the University of Toronto in 1886. So she was there before the first class of women had graduated. I'm telling you this to impress upon you that she was a trendsetter, a bit of a pioneer, okay? And if you can imagine a prestigious university with its first women putting their toes on the campus, sitting in the classrooms, taking their notes, taking their exams, you might think that for a lot of young women that would be a very intimidating yet exciting experience. Madge was hardly intimidated by anything, I have to say. She felt all the excitement of it and she embraced it. Coeducation was a very controversial initiative, and not everyone thought that the girls had a place on that campus, or any other campus for that matter. And Madge, even during her student days, wrote about that. She wrote about it in the campus paper, The Varsity. She wrote about it in the city papers throughout Toronto. And it was a bit risky to be writing, and so she adopted a pen name, and she sort of wrote in disguise. But everybody knew who she was because she was no small presence. And what she wrote was I'm paraphrasing, of course, but if you don't think women have a place on the university campus, you're quite wrong. Get used to the idea we're not going away. And she used to write in very strong terms like that, but she always wrote with a lot of humor and satire as well. So she was highly readable, very amusing, and her daddy back in Collingwood couldn't have been more proud. Every word that Madge published, Daddy clipped it out, pasted it into an old law book that he was no longer using for the practice, and created an enormous family scrapbook. God bless her daddy, because that scrapbook resides in the Collingwood Museum today. And that was one of the places where I began to get a lot of clues about this young Miss Robertson, who she was and how she thought. She graduated from the university for the first time in 1889 with a Bachelor of Arts in History and Modern Languages. But she quickly followed a path that a lot of educated young women of her day followed. That is, she became a teacher. And so immediately after graduation, she got a post to be a school teacher. And she hated it. Every minute of it, she hated it. She hated the fact that the local school teacher was constantly under surveillance for what she wore and who she was with and when she came in and when she, every move she made. And Madge did not appreciate that kind of surveillance and people imposing their views about her personal life. So she miserably completed her first year of teaching and said, "That's it, I'm done." Meanwhile, she had enrolled back at the University of Toronto, and she made history. She was the very first woman ever to graduate from the University of Toronto with a master's degree in 1890. Oh, that's impressive, right? Oh yeah, I was impressed. Madge was impressed. She constantly used those letters after her name for the rest of her life. Madge Robertson Watt, M.A. I have a friend who writes on the history of higher education in Canada, and as I was talking to him about my project on Mrs. Watt, he said, "Well, just a minute, hold up a little bit. You know what? Those master's degrees in that day, they weren't exactly rigorous. It's not like she wrote a thesis or anything, and she certainly wouldn't have sat to write exams, and she didn't really have to attend class." Okay, so what is there to this? He said, well, the truth is she would have written a short paper. There's no trace of it. I couldn't find it. He said, the truth is, an MA in those days was really something that your daddy might buy for you. Oh. Well, nevertheless, she was the first one to have one, and she was going to get as much mileage out of it as she could. And she did. Shortly after her graduation, after that failed attempt at teaching, she gravitated to what was probably one of her strongest skills, communication. She was a writer, and she loved to write. And so she got a job as a journalist. She used to sell her work on a freelance basis to the Toronto papers, and later, within a couple of years, she was actually recruited, like a headhunter came and said, "Who is this bright young voice in these Toronto papers? Miss Madge Robertson." And she was recruited to New York City. Now that's big times, okay? Think about this. The early 1890s, a young single woman from a small town in Ontario is recruited as a New York City journalist. Now she's really moving in the big leagues, isn't she? She used that position to come back to Toronto to begin a job, and this is unheard of, to begin a job as an editor of a ladies' periodical called the Ladies' Pictorial Weekly. And this was a magazine that was widely read by thousands of women every week across Canada and into the US a little bit as well. What's unheard of is that a 20-something-year-old was the editor of such a commercial publication. As editor, she had control over the content of that magazine. As editor, she had some dealings with advertisers and making sure the business venture would fly. And as editor, she had a voice every single week. And here she is. This is a picture of her with her back to the camera, sitting at her editorial desk, writing her next opinion piece. Madge was never short on opinions, I tell you. I was able to find a whole run, 1 year of the Ladies' Pictorial Weekly. It's very rare now, but it is held at the Library and Archives Canada. And my associate and I pored over every page. We said, what are the ideas? What is she saying? She has all this editorial power. What's the message? What's the message? The message was very interesting. At many levels, it seemed a very, very conservative message. There were all kinds of regular features in this magazine: fashion pages, household hints, short stories. She didn't write all the content, but she controlled the content, right? And then my clever research assistant graduate student partner said, wait a minute, I've read some of those household hints, and it's quite subversive what she's saying. Aha. There's more here than just a hint about how to remove a stain or how to polish silver. In fact, there were ideas embedded in those household hints columns that were very progressive for their day. I'm talking about ideas that said, girls and your daughters, when you have them doing household chores, they should be paid. I'm not talking about teaching your child how to manage money and giving her an allowance. I'm saying she did the labor, she deserves the wage. That was in the household hints column. Moreover, she said, listen, if you're teaching your daughter to sew on a button, you know, the fine motor skills are not gender specific. She didn't say it like that. But what she said was, you know, boys can learn to sew too. There's no reason why a boy shouldn't know how to sew on his own buttons. His future wife will thank you if you teach your sons these skills. Very, very interesting. And as we delve deeper into this writing and the writing that we found pasted in her daddy's scrapbook from New York, from American publications all over, it began to occur to us there were many, many progressive ideas in Madge Robertson's writing. So much so that we have written and published an article where we argued Madge Robertson was actually a new woman because she wrote about issues like, yes, women deserve the vote. Yes, women should have access, equal access to higher education with men. Yes, women deserve to earn a living wage. And not just a wage in some service sector, but professional wages. She ran a whole series of columns in one of the Toronto papers called By the Fireside, where she created a whole cast of fictional characters who would get together to drink tea by the fireside, maybe drinking something stronger too sometimes, and discussing what's appropriate for women. And they talked about the pros and cons of a variety, different profession every week. They talked about teaching. Oh yes, teaching is a very respectable profession. Oh yes, but they're going to watch your every move. It's really not that nice for a young woman. There was Madge's voice coming through. It's very autobiographical, actually. They talked about journalism. How is it? Is it possible for a woman to make a living as a journalist? Oh yes, it is. And Madge there revealed some of the business strategy of how journalism worked in the day, and how a freelancer could make a living if she found a literary agent and sold her work to more than one title at a time. So it was about vote, it was about education, it was about a working wage, but here's the kicker, and this is what she wrote most about in her humor pieces. It was about marriage, negotiating the terms thereof. That women ought not to enter into marriages unless they had done so with careful foresight and very aggressive negotiation skills. She wrote about this in humorous short stories. One of them was called, Should a Woman Propose? Answer, sure, why not? Yeah. Now that's a little, that's pushing some boundaries, right? The most extreme new women had some more progressive ideas than that about marriage. Well, why bother with a ceremony? Madge never went that far, but she certainly pushed boundaries. And what we argued in this article about her as a new woman is that she went about this very subversively. She did it as humor. So did she mean it, or is she just kidding? She said, here's how to do the household hints part, but she was playing with gender roles there. And I don't think she was kidding about that. She certainly wasn't kidding about employment, and she wasn't kidding about education or the vote. And so it was very interesting for us to look through what she'd written and see how autobiographical it was. And I felt where the archives were silent to me from any other source, I felt I could read her writings and really get inside her head quite a lot. So this is Miss Robertson and what she thought and how she turned out after those 2 university degrees. Whether he proposed or she did, I'm not sure, but she fell in love and she got married. The man she married was Dr. Alfred Watt. They actually met at the University of Toronto, and they had been varsity sweethearts. I know this because I read the gossip columns in the varsity from the University of Toronto, and I know that whenever he played rugby, she went to the away games. I know that when she read papers to the Literary Society, he came and listened. And I know that they had this ongoing romance. And maybe a lot of that business about a woman should negotiate the terms, maybe that was autobiographical too, I'm not sure. But by 1892, the end of 1892, Madge Robertson's mother died. Very sad and fairly sudden. And Madge came home from being away in New York and Toronto and moving in these progressive circles. She came home to be there for her mother's last days and the funeral. And in a rare glimpse into what she thought, years later she said, that was a transformative episode. My mother's death meant the end of my light-hearted writing. And she said that that death really caused her to grow up pretty quickly. That at the age of 25, she now needed to start thinking about herself as a grown-up woman. And so within a few weeks, this marriage deal was sealed that she would marry Dr. Watt. He had done very well for himself since graduation, and he'd moved from Toronto all the way west to the west coast of Canada and British Columbia, which at this point in time was still a bit of a frontier society. You know, there was a small group of highly educated elite with money, and the Watts entered into that small circle, and they took the center of it. How do I know that? I read the gossip columns again, this time from all the British Columbia papers in Victoria, which was the closest city to where they lived. Dr. Watt was enjoying a very lucrative job. He had been hired by the Government of Canada to be the inspector of quarantine. So if you know your Canadian geography, British Columbia, of course, is the most westerly province, and there's Vancouver Island, just off the coast of British Columbia, and that island is home to Victoria, the capital city of the province, and it was home to this quarantine station at a place called William Head, and that is where Dr. Watt worked. It was a very prestigious job. It was a very lucrative job. We did the calculations in terms of today's dollars. You think in pounds, I think in dollars. He was making more than 300,000 of them. Whether you want to calculate that in dollars or pounds, I don't mind. The point is, that's a lot of money in today's dollars, and it was a lot of money in those days' dollars as well. It did place the Watts very squarely at the center of the elite society that moved in those social circles in Victoria. And Madge loved every minute of it. She loved it. She loved being at the Empress Hotel when that Canadian Pacific Railway hotel finally opened to take tea, high tea in the afternoon. How pretentious. She liked to grow flowers on their rural property on Vancouver Island, and she liked to show her flowers in Victoria and take prizes. The Chelsea Flower Show is on, is it not? She took firsts for all kinds of things. Her flowers, her fruits, her vegetables, her jams, her handiwork. She loved rural life. Rural life. As long as she could take the steamer every now and then and get into the Empress for high tea, it wasn't so bad. She divided her life between rurality, and really this is the first time she ever really had anything to do with being rural, per se. And in writing my book, I adopted a theory that gender theorists use sometimes called the performed self. I think Mrs. Watt is a delicious example of the performed self. She's like a chameleon, and she puts on these new roles and new titles for herself, and she called herself rural for the first time while she was living on Vancouver Island. I also caught her in a bit of a lie. She said she stopped her lighthearted writing after her mother died. She did not. She still wrote very funny stories, published them, and made money for her writing for about 10 years after she first moved to Victoria and to William Head. So, this is where the Watts were living. This is what Mrs. Watt was into. She was a member of the Ladies' Press Club of Canada. She was an executive member in the University of Toronto Alumni Club. She was an examiner for the Royal Conservatory of Music. She was, you name it, she was part of it. The local Council of Women, all of it, she was at the center. And she had a small and influential group of peers who were also, lots of them, graduates of the University of Toronto. And it was from that position in 1911 that she looked up and said, you know, I'm doing fine and loving rural life, but I know that there are women who don't have access to all the amenities I do. She was constantly coming back to Ontario to visit her sister and her dad and her sister's family. And as you probably know, by 1897, so 4 years after Madge had left Ontario, the Ontario Women's Institutes were born in a place called Stony Creek, which is just outside of Toronto, not far, near Hamilton, Ontario. And the Women's Institutes, you might know this backstory, were founded by another Canadian woman, or at least that's how the story goes, that the name you should know and associate with the founding of the Women's Institutes in Canada is the name Adelaide Hoodless. All the WI members said in chorus, Adelaide Hoodless. Okay, here's a story that hasn't lost in the telling. Adelaide Hoodless, in the 1880s, experienced a personal tragedy when one of her children died. Terrible. This story goes that Adelaide Hoodless's baby died from drinking impure milk. And Mrs. Hoodless was devastated. Mrs. Hoodless was shocked. How could one of my children die from drinking impure milk? Let me just back up and say there's a couple of problems with that story too. First of all, it wasn't exactly a baby. It was a preschooler, a toddler, I guess we would say. This child did die from drinking impure milk. They called it summer complaint, right? So the child would have had some digestive trouble. It probably was from drinking unpasteurized, contaminated milk. Mrs. Hoodless decided that her mission in life from that point on was to emphasize and promote domestic science for mothers. If this happened to her, and she was an educated woman, not a rural woman at all, sorry, if that's this version of the story you think you know, she was actually married to a very wealthy industrialist in the town of Hamilton. And she decided to devote all her energy and resources to promoting domestic science education for women. Adelaide Hoodless wasn't actually a member of a WI ever. Sorry, she wasn't. But she did go around lecturing about domestic science, and when she got this gig to give a lecture at a group called the Farmers Institute near Stony Creek, Ontario, she accepted gladly, and it was a mixed audience of men and women, and the story doesn't lose in the telling. 101 people were present on a stormy night, snowy, cold night in February 1897 when they heard Adelaide Hoodless speak. One couple that was in the audience that night was the Lees, Erland Lee and his wife Janet. And have any of you WI women traveled to Canada and visited some of these historic sites in Canada? Okay, there is a historic house there called the Erland Lee Home, which is the headquarters, the place where the WI in Ontario was born. In fact, what had very little to do with Adelaide Hoodless after that one lecture. What it had to do with was Janet Leigh, who wrote, apparently by hand, on her dining room table, the Constitution for the first WI in Ontario. And the Women's Institutes were actually an offshoot of this men's group called Farmers' Institutes. They adopted a bit of a different model because the Farmers' Institutes would bring in learned professors from the Agricultural College to lecture on what the farmers called book learning. Not exactly, people who got their hands dirty in the soil. And the Farmers' Institutes weren't really doing very well. They weren't really a very popular movement. But the Ontario government was concerned in the 1890s about the rural depopulation. People were leaving the countryside in droves in Ontario to head for the industrial centres like Hamilton and Toronto to find employment. You can only divide a property so many times, right? And after a number of generations, they needed a different line of work for their children coming up. So people were leaving the farms at an alarming rate, and the Ontario government tried to stop that. They said, you know what? If the women in the countryside were happier, families would stay put. And they latched onto this idea of the Ontario Women's Institutes as a scheme. I have a colleague, Margaret Keckney, who has argued, a scheme to manipulate women into thinking that rural life would be okay if they could just have a few more amenities. And that's a story that's not often told, a version that's not often told of the Women's Institutes. I have a bit of a different take on it. I think that the rural women of Ontario saw the institutes as a good idea. They saw a government willing to give them money to set up groups so they could meet once a month and have tea and maybe learn something about domestic science, and then, you know what? They turned it on its head. They lobbied the government. They weren't supposed to be political, but they got a little bit political and started to lobby the government for all kinds of things. Well, you can be sure that when Madge Watt came home to Collingwood in the summers to visit her sister, she was very interested in the news of women's institutes. By 1911, she realized this is the exact thing we could use in rural British Columbia, and so she introduced the idea there. She got herself hired by the provincial government of British Columbia as one of 4 women who were paid to be Women's Institute organizers in BC, and she loved the work. She traveled up and down the island and all over. She loved it. She loved to lecture and have people listen to her. She loved to present her ideas and have people say, yes, good idea. And so she was thriving in this lovely life she had with a very well-to-do husband. During this time, she had given birth to 2 children, one in 1896, one in 1906, her 2 sons. And then, in the spring of 1913, tragedy struck the Watt family. In this case, it is not the death of a child, but it was the death of Dr. Watt himself. Tragic, unforeseen, and it threw Madge's world into a tailspin. What happened was that Dr. Watt's work was really to be in a constant state of readiness in case a ship should arrive, usually arriving from Asia. It would need to be inspected, and if he found any cases of contagious disease like smallpox or yellow fever, he would have to put the entire ship under quarantine. And in fact, in the spring, in May of 1913, he found 2 cases of smallpox aboard a ship. Everybody off the ship. Everybody had to go through a process. All their clothing and any luggage and anything that was on board had to be fumigated. And then everybody had to be put up in quarantine for a number of weeks. The 2 people suffering from smallpox on this occasion were Chinese men traveling, as you can imagine, not first class, but in steerage in this ship. 2 people of hundreds who were aboard. But everybody had to be quarantined because disease is no respecter of class or race. And everyone was quarantined, and most were happy campers, except the first-class passengers, who said, "This is deplorable. We cannot believe that our civil liberties are being curtailed in this way. These are substandard conditions." The day they arrived, unfortunately, Dr. Watt was doing a little work on the septic systems. It was kind of unpleasant, but he did finish the project within a day or 2. But everybody fumigated, everybody fed. It wasn't a terrible place to be if you were first class. There was actually a 9-hole golf course. It could be very comfortable. The press said, "This is a terrible turn of events, but we're sure that Dr. Watt will make everyone comfortable and have a lovely time. They'll all be entertained." I visited the site of the quarantine station. You might have a lovely time if you're a first-class passenger with golf and, good food and all of that. If you were not first class and white, you would spend your time in a little more cramped quarters, perhaps in the section that was designated Chinese, perhaps in the section that was designated Japanese, perhaps in the section that was designated Indian. They didn't mean Aboriginal people from Canada, East Indian. And everyone in the camp was separated by race. And in first class, you were separated by gender as well. Well, some of these very discontented patients protested. They wrote to the newspapers. They said, "This is terrible. We demand to be heard. Dr. Watt is keeping us in terrible conditions." And information was being fed to them by Dr. Watt's young and insubordinate assistant, who, by the way, belonged to the other political party. So this was a story of political, intrigue. The Watts were Liberals. He'd been appointed there by the Liberal government. In 1911, there was a very significant election, not unlike the one you've just experienced. It threw things on its head in ways that people didn't expect, and the Conservatives came to power. Dr. Watt's young assistant had been appointed by a Conservative government after 1911, very ill-suited to the job, very ill-suited to rural life, very ill-suited to taking direction from Dr. Watt, as it turned out. And Dr. Hunter had been looking for an opportunity to frame his boss. This was the perfect opportunity. And so he fed this to the press and to the first-class passengers, and the complaints reached Ottawa very quickly. And Dr. Watt was accused of two very serious charges. Number one, malpractice. Dr. Hunter said he never taught me how to inspect for quarantine. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm over my head here. Might have been more about his job performance than it was about Dr. Watt, but nevertheless, Dr. Watt was charged with malpractice. And more seriously, perhaps, the Watts, Mr. and Mrs., were thought to have been guilty of misappropriation of government funds. Ooh, money and foodstuffs. And so what could they do in Ottawa, except what there is to do? Establish a Royal Commission of Inquiry and investigate Dr. Watt. And that's what was happening in the summer of July 1913. At the same time, the Watts were suffering some other things in their personal lives. His brother, with whom he was very close, emotionally very close, back in Toronto, had just died suddenly. Their younger son was gravely ill, and they thought they might lose him. They had tremendous pressures bearing down on them. And then this, with Dr. Watt's work and the inquiry. Dr. Watt had suffered from he was a little fragile in terms of his mental health, and his doctor noticed this is too much. And so he ordered Dr. Watt to bed rest. Dr. Watt was admitted to the hospital in Victoria, and a few days later, Dr. Watt left his bed, jumped from the third-story window, and committed suicide. So, he looked guilty, right? And the papers were abuzz with this. And Mrs. Watt, her lovely life was over. It was over. This episode of political intrigue was definitely front-page news across Canada. And I just want to read to you so you get a little flavor of just how ugly this battle got. From a reporter who actually was a personal friend of the Watts, wrote, quote, "There is no room at all for doubt." This was written the day after. "There is no room at all for doubt that Dr. Watt died a victim of political persecution. This is a hard thing to say, but that the shattered condition of his nerves, which was the direct cause of his death, was due to the persecution to which he has of late been subjected, is beyond question. Far be it from us to suggest that those responsible for the recent investigation anticipated such tragic consequences, but the fact remains that a valuable officer has been lost to public service, a valuable life has been lost to the community as a result of an investigation into baseless charges involving the integrity of one in whom a high sense of honor was combined with an unusual degree of sensitiveness." It's good to have friends in the press, I suppose, but I think that even that kind of attention would have been more than Madge Watt could bear. And so her first instinct was to close out all of her affairs in British Columbia and escape the publicity. So the photograph I showed you at the beginning of this talk, here it is again. Mrs. Watt with her sons in 1913, as they would have looked when they got on board a ship in Montreal in October of 1913 to come to England at the invitation of Mrs. Watt's friend Josephine Godman, who had married into a family with property, who said, Madge, come to rural Sussex and just recover from your grief. But you need to think Downton Abbey. You need to think about families with lots of country homes and property, and things were not good for the Godmans. It was a great place for Madge to go with the boys and escape. She quickly put the little one, Sholto was his nickname, into boarding school. And she was recovering. Of course, it was already the fall of 1913, and within a few months, the war would break out. She was on the wrong side of the Atlantic, and she got trapped here, you might say. Now, because of the nature of Dr. Watt's death, Mrs. Watt was not entitled to any of his life insurance money. And he had a lot of life insurance coverage. His brother sold life insurance back in Toronto. Dr. Watt had bought a lot of coverage, and I know that because for the first, and to my knowledge, only time the Canadian Census ever asked how much life insurance coverage do you have was in 1911. So I happen to know that Dr. Watt had accumulated no small fortune in life insurance coverage, but because of the nature of his death, his widow was unable to claim it. Therefore, she needed an income. And when that war broke out, if we can have the next slide, Mrs. Watt needed to find something to do. She said she was very imperially minded, completely loyal to the empire, and she wanted to serve in doing war service. This is her dashing older son, Lieutenant H.R. Watt, who was actually promoted quickly through the ranks and was the aide-de-camp for the General Currie, the leader of the Canadian forces. Robin Watt, or Robertson, named for his grandfather in Collingwood, saw active duty, and he was at the Battle of the Somme. He wrote letters home to his mother about that. He documented through the days of that battle as he watched peers and his underlings fall. And he wrote to her and said, "Dear mother, I have no idea why I've survived. It must be because of your prayers." I tell you that because Mrs. Watt had a certain social currency with women in England who also had sent their sons and their lovers and their husbands to war. And whenever Mrs. Watt spoke about Robin and the sacrifices he was making and how he'd been wounded at the front on more than one occasion, it gave her a real affinity with the women to whom she was speaking. Good thing, because Mrs. Watt didn't have a lot of affinity in circles in London. When she tried to say, she needed to make money, remember? She approached the British authorities and said, "You know what? I have a very good idea. I do believe I can help to win this war. I have a strategy. I have a strategy to guarantee and secure the food supply." Oh, British authorities said, "Do tell." She said, "Hire me, and I shall." Great consultant, right? So she got on, and this is a longer story than the way I'm telling it today, but she became employed by the Agricultural Organization Services. Her great strategy? Knowing that there just might well be a German naval blockade. If the Germans accomplished that, they would starve out the English, right? The Allied forces would fall. She said, we must prevent that by having a secure domestic food supply. Here's her strategy. Get all the rural village women, and the farm women and town women together in small groups and have them plant gardens. They'll be called victory gardens. And the groups that these women form will be called Women's Institutes. It works in Canada, it will surely work here. And when she presented this idea in circles to people of influence in London and other high places, they said, "No, that would never work here. What a silly idea. Maybe in Canada it would work, but not here. You don't understand England. You don't understand how there's a class structure here. You don't understand that you can't have all women mixing. That will never happen here." Madge was shocked because everywhere she'd ever ever gone and spoken to people with influence, they listened to her. When she spoke in Victoria, BC, they said, oh, what a good idea. Would you like to be paid to be a Women's Institute organizer? Yes, please. When she tried to give these ideas in London, they said, who is this Mrs. Watt? Oh, a Canadian. Oh, a colonial. Oh. Does she have money? No. Does she have title? No. Oh. She had a terrible time. She couldn't get anyone to listen to her at first. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that the very first WI in the UK was not founded anywhere near London, although Mrs. Watt thought because she lived in probably the most British city in Canada, Victoria, BC. We say that Victoria is more British than the British themselves. That sometimes happens in colonial settings. They get a bit stuck in time. And she thought she knew that if you went to the center of power, that's how it goes. And so she figured when she came here, she actually wrote this is how it works in the UK. Things radiate out from London. Everything starts there and it radiates out. Well, apparently not. She tried that and it didn't work. She did get another invitation to lecture, and she loved to lecture. She got an invitation to the university at Bangor to come and give a lecture there about this scheme of hers. The reason she got invited was thanks to someone who had been in Canada, Lord Earl Grey, who had been our Governor General and thought he knew about women's institutes. People should listen to Mrs. Watt. And she went to Bangor where she was heard. And people thought, yes, this could work. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence. You can't get much further from London without falling off the edge than going to Anglesey and going to that place with the longest name in the world. And I won't say the whole thing, but I know that the beginning goes like this, Clanferpool, and at the end it goes go, 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 something like that. I don't know. It's the longest name like this. That's where the very first Women's Institute in the UK was founded by Madge Watt in 1915. Quickly after that, the idea caught on and it started to snowball. So there were more WIs founded in Anglesey, and then she came back to England, the Worcestershire Herald, Saturday, November the 25th, 1916. I'm sorry that the text is not entirely clear, but it says, after she had spoken here, in proposing a vote of thanks to Mrs. Watt, the chairman mentioned she had just returned from seeing her son, who has been badly wounded at the front. There's the social currency piece, right? Refreshments, kindly provided by Mr. and Mrs. G.F. Hooper, were then partaken of, after which a business meeting was held when it was unanimously decided to form an institution in Pershore. They meant Women's Institute. The following officials were elected, and that's how the article ends. So yes, here we are in Pershore, one of the first to take root in England. And just to wrap this up, I want to show you some pictures of Mrs. Watt from a little later on. After World War I, for the work she had done here, she was awarded the honor of Member of the Order of the British Empire. She loved those initials after her name. Mrs. Alfred Watt, M.A., M.B.E. That was her new identity. And this picture on the right, many of you, if you're WI members, you may have seen this before. It's quite a famous one of the founding meeting of the Associated Country Women of the World in Stockholm in 1933. And that group really got off the ground thanks to the International Council of Women. That's a story for another day, or for the back of the book, if you will. And then the other picture that's there is Mrs. Watt addressing the London ACWW conference in 1939, which was held in conjunction with the NFWI AGM, the National Federation of Women's Institutes annual general meeting. The big question for me as a historian is this. Madge Robertson Watt, quite a character. How should she be remembered? There's what happened, and then there's what we tell ourselves about what happened and how we tell what happened. And what first got me intrigued about this character, Mrs. Watt, was my work on the Women's Institutes in Ontario and Canada. And everywhere I went in Canada, and I heard her name, they told me, oh, she's wonderful, she's a hero. You know, she's the founder of the ACWW, I'm the founder of the WI in the UK, quite an extraordinary woman. I thought, oh, okay. Well, let me go to the UK and see. So I came here and I asked, what do you know about Mrs. Watt? What can you tell me about Mrs. Watt? And I went to the archives, turning pages, saying, what can you tell me about Mrs. Watt? And what I found was, Mrs. Watt was not a popular woman here. She's hardly celebrated as a hero. She was a bit of a pain, actually. She caused a lot of problems for the London office of the National Federation of the Women's Institutes. She did things that WI members are not supposed to do, like talk about politics. She talked about how, and get this, in the 1920s, in England, she's saying that the Labour Party has got it all wrong. That's not a good idea. And Lady Denman, who was chairing the National Federation of Women's Institutes here, was constantly trying to do this, put out all these fires that Mrs. Watt was lighting. They couldn't control her. And she was a bit incorrigible, always had been. And she tried to work in conjunction with the National Federation of Women's Institutes, but when they wouldn't give her position or title or place on the letterhead of the organization, she was a bit of a lone wolf, a bit of a free agent. It was a little scary, actually, the trouble that she stirred up for the WI. And so I had these two competing versions, on my side of the Atlantic, on your side of the Atlantic. And I decided in the year 2004 to use some of my grant money to go to a meeting, a triennial meeting of the Associated Country Women of the World, and see what women in other parts of the world think about Mrs. Watt. So I went to Australia. In 2004, when the ACWW was meeting there for its triennial, I talked the grant agency into it because, it's a pretty nice trip to go to Australia. But I said, listen, I can talk to women from dozens of countries all at the same time in 1 week. It's very efficient. You should send me. And they did. And when I got there, I simply started working the room and asked, what do you know about Mrs. Watt? Where are you from? What have you heard in India? What have you heard in Africa? What have you heard about her in all these countries? The ACWW, in case you don't know, is active today in more than 70 countries across the globe with more than 9 million members. It has consultative status with the UN and is constantly bringing resolutions to the attention of the UN on women's matters. Questions today like human trafficking and genital mutilation and genetically modified food and all manner of things. And I thought, surely everybody's heard of Mrs. Watt. Some hadn't heard of her at all. Some had heard the Canadian version. Some had heard the British version. And I thought, aha, I am into a historian's delight here. To untangle these strands and try to understand why her story is told one way in one place, another way in another place. And that is what I have devoted myself to doing over the last 15 years, putting together these fragments of information and trying to read Mrs. Watt and how we should remember her. And the result of all that is my book, which has just come out, published by the University of Toronto Press. We'll have the last slide. There it is. This is what it looks like. A Great Rural Sisterhood, Madge, Robertson, Watt, and the ACWW. The book is now available as of last week in the UK on Amazon. You can also order it directly through the University of Toronto Press if you like. The Kindle edition for sure. You can be reading it within 20 minutes if you buy it now. But the paper is available on Amazon. I understand that there's some arrangement to have copies here locally.
I think Pershore Bookshop is going to get it on.
Yeah, there we go. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention this afternoon, for listening about the indomitable Mrs. Watt.